Um, I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute. You can stop talking without my ringing a glass, I hope. Thank you all for joining us for what, no kidding, I think may be a potentially historic moment in our little back corner of the world. The IMF, under a lot of people's work and leadership, has come out with a new study on energy subsidy reforms, lessons and implications, and its key word is reforms. It's, as you'll see from David Lipton's presentation, about whom more in a moment, it's really not just about the scale and scope of these problems, these potential distortions, which is mammoth, but it's about the very hopeful examples we have of small open economies, of emerging economies, of developing economies that have managed to, for the sake of their people, make major changes. And we at the Peterson Institute are absolutely thrilled to be able to present this work, or to provide a forum for the presentation of this work. As many of you know, we do provide a forum, a convening place for senior friends from the official sector who have something to say and who are willing to subject themselves to substantive scrutiny, and it's analytically interesting. And today's event and today's speaker fit all those requirements. Important, on the record, analytically interesting, ready to discuss and to engage, and if necessary, debate. Our format today is we're going to have David Lipton come up and give an initial presentation of the report. Then we're going to be joined by three distinguished panelists. Bill Klein from our own institute. Many of you know Bill has been working on both global poverty issues, the distortions from subsidies, and in particular energy issues for decades. His seminal Economics of Global Warming came out in 1992 when there were only a few people, Frank Loy, who's here today, Nick Stern, who's not here today, Bill Klein, and others were thinking about this. And now those issues have become very ripe. Second, we're going to hear from Andrew Steer, a friend of mine who is the president of the World Resources Institute. As Andrew and I were just discussing, where we're small, they're big. Where we're concentrated here, they're global. And where we're researchers, they're very much on the ground doers. But Andrew has worked a long, distinguished career at the World Bank, including as the advisor on climate change issues and the representative, and at DFID, the Department for International Development in the UK. And we're just delighted to have him here giving an independent NGO perspective. But thirdly, and I think frankly a special treat, is we have Robin West of PFC Energy, speaking third on our panel. Many of you know or know of Robin. He is unique in my experience in that he is someone who understands the energy market, in particular the petroleum market and petroleum development and all its complexity. He is forthright in talking about it, and he is listened to by both policymakers and senior officials, senior executives in the energy business. What many of you may not know is he also has a distinguished public service career, having been an Assistant Secretary of the Interior and having been an Assistant Secretary of Defense on the international policy side, and so comes naturally also as a supporter of the U.S. Institute of Peace, someone naturally accustomed to the give and take we have at think tanks. So it's going to be an excellent panel, and then after that we will, as usual, open it up for on-the-record, everyone's discussion. But just the final introduction is just to say it is my personal privilege to introduce David Lipton, the first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF. David has been, for many of us in my generation, a role model of someone who combines serious work and serious policymaking. As many of you know, he served with distinction in the Clinton Treasury, eventually as Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs. He was, prior to joining the IMF this time around, was the Special Assistant to the President and in charge of International Economic Affairs and National Economic Council, and was a Sherpa. And he, of course, has a distinguished private sector background, having worked at Moore Capital and at Citi when it was Citi something as opposed to Citi. and like many of us in the room, is a graduate of Harvard's PhD program in economics, so he comes by his knowledge hard-earned. On that note, I would like to invite David up here to give us the introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to the Peterson Institute for hosting this event. It's great to see Fred here and see that you're back at it. But it's really great, Adam, to see the Institute carrying on the tradition of taking on tough issues, new issues, getting a great group like this group together to hash things out and give everyone a chance to have their view. Today I'll present the key findings of a new study the IMF is publishing on energy subsidies. It'll be published today, put on the IMF's website, including in Arabic and French. Over the decades, the subject of energy subsidies used to evoke the image of oil-producing countries that offered cheap gasoline and fuel to their people. But in recent years, we've heard much more about countries that are finding the fiscal weight of energy subsidies growing too large to bear. In some countries, budget deficits are becoming unmanageable and are threatening the stability of the economy. Where political systems have generated large and growing subsidy burdens, in part to placate restive populations, countries now find that they're suffering from fiscal paralysis and from energy shortages. Headlines from countries like Egypt and Pakistan focus on the need to address this burden because it's a burden that can jeopardize fiscal sustainability and jeopardize balance of payments viability. In many other countries, subsidies remain a stumbling block to higher growth by squeezing out needed health, education, and infrastructure spending. The study shows there are 20 countries that maintain energy subsidies in excess of 5% of GDP. But as I'll explain today, energy subsidies are a wider and more pervasive problem with consequences for many individual countries, but also for the global economy and for the environment. The G20 acknowledged this point in the Pittsburgh Leaders Summit in 2009, pledging to eliminate all inefficient fossil fuel subsidies over the medium term. I don't know exactly what constitutes the medium term, but I think it's surely time to get on with fulfilling that very important commitment. Subsidies are an issue in practically every country in the world. Pre-tax subsidies, what I'll call pre-tax subsidies, those which arise when energy consumers pay less than the supply cost of energy, are high in many emerging and developing economies and have risen in recent years due to limited pass-through of increases in international energy prices. Although pre-tax subsidies are not a large enough problem to be causing fiscal difficulties in advanced economies, many advanced economies have what we'll call tax subsidies, where the taxes imposed on energy are not high enough to account for all of the adverse effects of excessive energy consumption, including on the environment. So in essence, in other words, where there are externalities that are not being addressed. The issue of energy subsidy reform is not new. Indeed, in several cases, the IMF and country authorities have been discussing potential reforms for several decades. Despite widespread recognition of the adverse consequences, energy subsidies have proven very difficult to reform. The surge in international energy prices in recent years has drawn further attention to this issue, including, as I mentioned, from the G20 itself. And the link between subsidies, the consumption of energy, and climate change adds an important new dimension to the debate on energy subsidies, which I will return to in a minute. My presentation today will cover three topics. First, the consequences of energy subsidies. Second, the magnitude of these subsidies. And third, the ingredients for successful energy subsidy reform. Let's turn now to the first topic, the consequences of energy subsidies. Those go well beyond the fiscal costs. Let me review the channels through which adverse effects are felt. First, low and subsidized prices make it unattractive for the private sector or even state-owned enterprises to invest in the energy sector and to expand energy production. This reduces the supply of energy, which of course is a critical input for growth and quite vital in poorer countries. In Africa, for example, the losses incurred by electricity suppliers due to subsidized prices have severely constrained their ability to invest in new electrical capacity and to improve service quality. As a result, installed per capita generation capacity in sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, is about 1/3 of what it is in South Asia, 1/10 of what it is in Latin America. Second, subsidies crowd out public spending that can boost growth, as I mentioned, including infrastructure, education, and health, and as well crowds out spending on the social safety net. Some countries spend more on energy subsidies than on public health and education put together, undermining the development goal of promoting human capital. Third, subsidies result in a misallocation of resources to capital and energy-intensive technologies, with overuse of technologies that are subsidized and hence cheaper. Subsidy reform can lead to a more efficient allocation of resources, which would help spur higher economic growth over the longer term. Removing energy subsidies can also help prolong the availability of non-renewable energy resources and strengthen the incentives for research and development into energy saving and alternative technologies. Fourth, by increasing energy consumption, subsidies exert pressure on the balance of payments of net energy importing countries. And fifth, again by boosting energy consumption and thus emissions, subsidies aggravate climate change and worsen local pollution as well as congestion. I'll be spending some time here talking about this subject. Our estimates indicate that subsidy reform would play a significant role in offsetting climate change. Limiting what I call pre-tax subsidies alone would reduce CO2 emissions by about 1 to 2% worldwide. For comparison's sake, if countries implemented the emissions reduction pledges made in the 2009 Copenhagen Accord, global emissions in 2020 would be lower by about 7%, below what would have happened otherwise. In other words, about 15 to 30% of a key global emissions goal can be achieved just by stopping to encourage excessive energy use via pre-tax subsidies. And the gains from tackling what we've called post-tax subsidies, the costs of externalities, would be even larger. This would likely reduce CO2 emissions by 4.5 billion tons, a 13% reduction. This amount's significant even when viewed alongside the objectives of global climate change negotiations. These estimates point to the substantial benefits of using fiscal instruments to achieve climate change objectives. The time has come for subsidy reform and carbon taxation. Finally, sixth, energy subsidies reinforce inequality because they mostly benefit upper income groups who are the biggest consumers of energy. For example, in the case of electricity subsidies, a large majority of the poor in Africa receive no benefit because they aren't connected to the electricity grid. Moreover, of course, most subsidies are conveyed by controlling prices, keeping prices low. So the subsidy you receive is proportional to the energy that you use. So it's no wonder that the greatest beneficiaries are those with cars and air-conditioned houses. On average, in our sample of countries, the richest 20% of households in low and middle income countries capture 43% of the benefits of fuel subsidies. Nevertheless, and you can see here on this slide the difference across different categories of subsidized products, and in some cases the disparity is even wider. Nevertheless, a sharp increase in energy prices can still have a significant impact on the poor, which means it's essential to put in place mitigating measures to protect the poor as subsidy reform is implemented, a subject I will come back to. Let me turn to the second topic, the magnitude of energy subsidies by region and by product. Our figures are based on a comprehensive set of estimates for fuel energy in 176 countries, covering petroleum products, electricity, natural gas, and coal in 2011. We don't cover subsidies for renewable energy. They involve a smaller share of energy use, and the disaggregated data by country are not sufficient for us to include them at this point. Before discussing the figures, let me go back to more carefully define consumer subsidies. We estimate both pre- and post-tax subsidies. Pre-tax subsidies arise when energy consumers pay less than the supply cost of energy, including transportation and distribution costs. Tax subsidies arise if energy taxes are too low. Under efficient taxation, as economists would describe that, energy should be taxed in the same way as any other consumer product, plus an adjustment for negative externalities, such as the effect of energy consumption on climate change, on local pollution, on congestion. We define post-tax subsidies to be the sum of the pre-tax subsidies and the tax subsidies. Beyond consumer subsidies, our figures also try to capture producer subsidies, but we have, again, some data limitations. These arise especially where state-owned enterprises in the energy sector make financial losses not because of low prices to consumers, but because they're efficient, and that is supported by the government. Let's turn to the numbers. Pre-tax subsidies are substantial. They amount to 0.7% of global GDP, or about 2% of global tax revenues. They mostly comprise subsidies for petroleum products and electricity. In terms of their regional distribution, the Middle East and North Africa, or MENA for short, accounts for about half of pre-tax subsidies. Also, in terms of regional GDP and government revenues, pre-tax subsidies are highest in the MENA region, reaching about 8.6% of GDP and 21.8% of government revenues. Here you can see the distribution relative to GDP and relative to revenues. When we look at post-tax subsidies, the full magnitude of subsidies is alarming. There are 4 times, the post-tax subsidies, as you can see from the numbers and the size of the circles, are 4 times as large as the pre-tax subsidies, with more than a quarter devoted to the coal sector. Worldwide, post-tax subsidies are estimated to be about $1.9 trillion, about 2.7% of global GDP, and the equivalent of 8% of global government revenues. The global distribution of post-tax subsidies is very different from what we've seen a minute ago for pre-tax subsidies. In fact, advanced economies account for about 40% of the global total. That, of course, is because of the size of those economies and the fact that very few countries are, in fact, engaged in taxation to capture or internalize externalities. All advanced economies are providing energy subsidies on a post-tax basis. Throughout the world, some 159 economies are subsidizing energy, underscoring that energy subsidy reform is truly a global challenge. There are substantial differences in the size of subsidies relative to GDP and relative to revenue. In this slide, you can see, as a share of GDP, post-tax subsidies are the highest in the MENA region and the lowest in the advanced economies when calculated as a ratio. As a share of revenues, subsidies are much higher in MENA and emerging and developing Asia than in other regions. Yet in absolute terms, the top 3 subsidizers around the world are the United States at about $500 billion, China $250 million, and Russia about $100 billion. Across all regions, underpricing for externalities accounts for a large share of the post-tax subsidies. Here the red are the pre-tax subsidies, and we've broken the tax subsidies into those that come from having inadequate VAT taxation on energy, and the blue, the absence of externality-based taxation. In sum, energy subsidies are large on a global scale, and this is by no means an issue just for emerging and developing economies. Let me last turn to my third topic, ingredients for successful energy reform. We identify the ingredients for successful reform by looking at 22 case studies of subsidy reform. And the IMF has been involved in some of these with countries, and through our interactions have achieved I think, quite intimate understanding of what has been tried and what works and what does not. These comprise cases of reform of petroleum, electricity, and coal subsidies, and cover a broad range of countries across different regions of the world. We examined instances of success and also those that were partially successful or unsuccessful. We have an appendix to our paper that goes through the individual cases if you're interested. This was supplemented, as I mentioned, by the lessons that we gained ourselves, including through the technical assistance work that we've provided on subsidy reform, and the insights we have found that have come from other institutions that have studied this subject. The case studies underscore that there are a number of good examples that could be emulated, such as the Philippines and Turkey with respect to petroleum products, Kenya and Uganda with respect to electricity. We found that there are 6 key ingredients to successful subsidy reform. Public support can be gained by spelling out a comprehensive reform plan. This should clearly include articulating long-term objectives such as achieving full price liberalization and improving the quality of services. In the Philippines and Turkey, for example, full price liberalization and structural reform of the energy sector for both fuel and electricity were articulated as the ultimate goals for reform. This allowed the public and governments to focus on and to stick to these long-term goals as the reform process went forward. Designing a comprehensive subsidy reform strategy also requires information on the fiscal and macroeconomic effects of subsidies and on who are the winners and who are the losers. In Ghana in 2005, the government commissioned an independent poverty and social impact analysis to assess who would be the winners and losers and take that into account. This was an important step towards persuasively communicating to the public the need for reform, for designing policies to reduce the impact on those who would be most affected. Stakeholders should be consulted and invited to participate in the subsidy reform. This stakeholder approach has proven successful in a number of cases. In Kenya, for example, where reform was comprehensive and electricity subsidies were fully eliminated, the electricity tariff, the resistance to electricity tariff increases was overcome over a number of years after intense negotiations with the stakeholders, particularly with large consumers, and efforts to communicate clearly the objectives and the benefits that would come from reform. A second element in successful subsidy reform is a clear communication strategy. And this is, I think, also if you look at failed cases, they most often fail when there's a failure in the communication strategy. What's important is informing the public of the size of the subsidies and the potential benefits that would come from subsidy reform. It's important to make clear the benefits that would come from being able to increase priority spending in social sectors using the proceeds, the savings from subsidy reform. Information campaigns have underpinned success in this regard in a number of countries, including fuel subsidy reforms in Namibia and the Philippines, and the electricity subsidy reforms in Armenia and Uganda. Strengthening transparency is also a key component of a successful communication strategy. It's particularly important to disseminate information on the size of subsidies and how they're funded. This is particularly relevant for oil exporting countries, where subsidies are most often provided implicitly and not shown in the budget, not recorded as tax expenditures. Subsidy expenditures should be compared to the spending on priority sectors, as well as to planned increases in those outlays that could result from freeing up additional revenue through subsidy reform. Governments should also disclose as much information as possible about how prices are formulated and the factors behind the planned price increases. Both Ghana and South Africa regularly publish such details for petroleum products on their government websites and make the information public through the national media. The third element in successful subsidy reform is to appropriately phase and sequence the price increases. The phasing of price increases for a particular country will depend on a range of factors, including the size of the price increases required to eliminate the subsidies, the fiscal position, and the political and social context in which reforms are being undertaken. Phased increases, of course, allow time for households, businesses, governments to adjust their consumption of energy. They give governments time to work on strengthening the social safety net and protecting the most affected. A slower pace of reform, however, reduces budgetary savings in the short term, so there are trade-offs that have to be weighed. Price increases can be phased across different products. For example, price increases can initially be larger for the products consumed most heavily by upper-income households, like gasoline. As the safety net is strengthened, subsequent rounds of reform can include larger price increases for fuel products that are more important to the budgets of the poor. I'd mention one very interesting example in the case of Iran. They provided the transfers to support the poor in advance of beginning the price increases, and that avoided the problem that people might otherwise have seen the price increases and had uncertainty about what kind of compensation that they might get. The fourth component of a successful subsidy reform strategy is improvements in the efficiency of state-owned enterprises that can help relieve the fiscal burden. This can be accomplished by improving information on their costs and, armed with this information, setting performance targets and incentives. There's also the scope to improve the collection of energy bills in many countries, especially for electricity. The fifth element in successful reform subsidy is, and this is, I think, perhaps the most critical, implementing mitigating measures to protect the poor. Targeted cash or near cash transfers, such as vouchers, are a preferred approach and have been very successful in a number of places. Cash transfers give beneficiaries flexibility to purchase the amount and type of energy that best suits their needs, or to buy other goods and services and not have this benefit come only in the form of energy. Transfers also remove the need for governments to be directly involved in the distribution of subsidized energy to households, which is often costly, prone to abuse and inefficiency. When cash transfers are not feasible, other programs can be expanded while administrative capacity is developed. This should focus on existing programs that can be expanded quickly, possibly with some improvements in improving the targeting of the programs. Some examples that we've seen include school meals, public works, subsidized urban transport have been used as support programs. In Ghana, these measures also included the elimination of fees for state-run primary and secondary schools, a benefit that was very much appreciated. The restructuring of state-owned enterprises may require sector-specific supportive measures. Policies that mitigate the impact on workers and promote restructuring can increase support for subsidy reform. In the case of Poland's coal sector, unemployed miners had access to social assistance and job training during a transition period. Finally, the sixth ingredient of successful subsidy reform is to depoliticize the whole setting of energy prices. This is necessary to make reforms durable. It can be facilitated by implementing an automatic pricing mechanism with a smoothing rule to avoid sharp energy price adjustments. In many countries, every time international energy prices change, the government has to take an action to raise prices, which is very unpopular. And the involvement of the government in that way brings attention and makes it more difficult to bring about the change. Let me sum up and finish by saying that, to me, the bottom line is that energy subsidization is a major global problem, but it's a problem that can be solved. Subsidies have adverse effects on public finances, economic growth, equity, and the environment. We can see that reducing subsidies is not easy, but many countries now see the benefits of doing so and are actually intending to try to do so. With adequate planning, carefully designed mitigating measures, and a good communications strategy, this job can be done. Indeed, our study shows some have already succeeded. The IMF will draw attention to this issue. We are ready to help those who want to move forward. And our mantra will be, subsidy reform is needed, but it's better to do it the right way than to do it right away. Thank you very much.